everyone, and welcome to the Moving Beyond Family Struggles Summit. In this conversation, we'll be talking with Lynn Fraser, and I'm going to start by reading out Lynn's wonderful bio to introduce her to everyone. Lynn Fraser brings the depth of 23 years experience teaching meditation. She specialises in holding a safe, trusted space for healing trauma in her groups and private online sessions. Lynn lives near family, ocean and forest in Nova Scotia, Canada. She is a senior teacher in the Himalayan yoga meditation tradition, a certified facilitator of the Kalobi Inquiries, a somatic mindfulness method of healing, and founder of the Still Point method of healing trauma. Lynn has been interviewed on major podcasts in her field, such as the Trauma Therapist podcast, Therapy Chat, Not Another Anxiety Show, and more. Lynn is the founder of and interviewer for the Kalobi Centre's Radical Recovery Summit, an online exploration of addiction recovery with a diverse group of thought leaders and innovators in the field, including Gabor Mate, Rick Hansen, Resma Menachem, Irene Lyon, and James S. Gordon. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today. It really is a true honour to have you on our summit.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so glad. Thank you, Lynn. Now, you do the most amazing work in the areas of healing from trauma, meditation, healing in general, and how to live a life free from suffering. And you do so with such love, compassion, and kindness. And then I'd love if you could share with us what led to your passion and all the work you do in these areas.
So the love and compassion piece, I think, is such a foundation. And a lot of that comes from my own inner personal work. I had a pretty normal upbringing. I didn't have any big T trauma in my earlier childhood. There was no violence, no addiction. It was just kind of a regular middle-class family. And what was really missing, though, was emotional connection. So when things happened, I had some sexual trauma at age 12, and I didn't have anywhere to go. I knew that if I told my parents what had happened, I would be blamed and shamed for it. And I just internalized it, and that set off several years of trauma in my teen years and drinking and drugs, which kind of ended up around my mid-20s. I was starting to kind of come out of that and recover from that. And then as I look back now, I can really see that I tried many different ways. I tried talk therapy. I got involved with yoga and meditation in my late 30s, early 40s. And as I was doing that, I was kind of coming closer and closer to some deeper healing. And over the last several years of working with, I do this somatic in the body mindfulness inquiry, and in a way that's trauma informed so that I could stay with what's happening right now in my present moment and kind of reconnect with that child who had experienced so much trauma and didn't have anywhere to go. And out of that, it kind of developed into the work that I do now with people. So I've been teaching meditation for over 2 decades, but for the last 7, 8 years, I've really been focusing on healing trauma, partly through meditation and partly through this inquiry. So it's very much a personal journey for me. And as I became more and more free and more stable, better nervous system, more resilience and strength, then that's where I offer what I offer from that place of healing.
Thank you for sharing that, Lynn, because it really shines through in your work, that deep understanding and compassion for people that are experiencing those things. And also, I love that you touched on your own personal experience, and thank you for sharing so openly, because the truth is, for many, a lot of focus with conflict in family can be on the physical separation that happens and results in family. But I love that you shared from your own experience and the reminder that the truth that it can be an emotional distancing as well. We can, exactly what you said, exist within a household or within a family, but feel very detached emotionally from a family member or family. So I really thank you for sharing so openly with us. That's wonderful. And I'd love to start to continue on from that, Lynn. I'd love to start what you touched on at the end there, your work in trauma. And I'd love to start by talking about the wonderful work you do in this area, because I think we're seeing an increased focus on trauma in society, but I don't think we really understand it yet. I feel like we're still lacking education into this area in regards to the presence it can have in our daily lives, the ongoing effect it can have, and more importantly, how we prepare for when trauma is present in our lives. And
Mhm.
I'd love to ask your thoughts on this and this idea that we don't really know how to prepare for trauma or the steps to take when we're faced with it.
Mhm. So there's a couple of ways that we can work with that. One is everybody at all times could benefit from relaxing and building resilience.
Mm,
And so, some of the bigger things that happened, I had 2004 and 2005, two really big traumas happen for me. And at that time, I'd been meditating already for about 12 years. I'd been doing a lot of yoga. My breath was very stable. My nervous system was pretty stable. And it really kicked me
mm,
hard. I mean, I really floundered and really went into a period of intense examination. And I ended up with PTSD out of one of the things that happened. But the resilience and the strength that I had from that 12 years of meditation really stood me in good stead that time, because I was able to build on that. And so that's something we can all do, is just the breathing alone, learning how to breathe diaphragmatically, learning about the nervous system. So, when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, we often hold our breath. um, Learning how to release the breath so that our nervous system can come back to a sense of safety. There's so many grounding and orienting tools, and there's a lot of good research now, but there's also just a lot of really great teachers who are
mm.
teaching about trauma now. And as long as you're working with something that's somatic in your body and that's dealing with the nervous system, then you're gonna have some real benefits there. And so some of the people that I would really recommend is Gabor Mate for sure.
Yes.
And Resma Menakem, my grandmother's hands. He has a lot of very practical exercises in there as well about the nervous system. And he's talking more about racialized trauma. And he's also a somatic experiencing person and a counselor. And Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps a Score. There's some kind of
Mm,
classic
yes.
classic ones. But also Deb Dana is a clinical social worker who works a lot
Yes.
with Stephen Porges, and her work is very practical again. So you could get her course, Befriending the Nervous System, or her new book, Anchored. And then also, we were talking before about the summit that you do and how it's so helpful to bring together these groups of people that are kind of on the leading edge of healing. And so the Radical Recovery Summit that I do also
Yes.
brings those people together. And so you can listen to interviews with a bunch of different, I mean, they're experts, but it's from their own heart and from their own experience that we speak as well. So there's a
Mm,
lot of really good resources now. And then if you do have something big come up, then you have a base of resilience and a base of understanding, well, actually, how does trauma work? And you have some kind of optimism that there are steps that we can take that will help, and we can support ourselves. And so that's also very important. And
exactly.
then to acknowledge that we're 2 years now into the global pandemic of COVID.
So true.
Everybody's stressed. And a lot of what we're seeing is fight, flight, and freeze in the nervous system.
Mm,
And everybody's really struggling right now. So it's
so
a
true, Lynn.
yeah.
Yes.
Mm,
Well, they are great resources that you shared, and we'll also be able to add those links and reminders next to this video so that people can be reminded of those resources, because it's so needed, and exactly what you touched on, the truth that prevention is better than cure. If we prepare ourselves, because the
mm,
reality that we're all going to come up against trauma at some point.
well,
And certainly for anyone that is here today with us, there is the truth that there's trauma or upset in their life. So
mhm,
rather than wait for it to grip you, really
mhm.
start being aware of and normalize it, that trauma does happen in life and that there are ways that we can adjust and prepare for it. So they're great resources and advice that you shared, Lynn. Thank you for that. And you
And
mentioned oh yeah, sorry, you go.
I was just going to say, we have this idea, maybe from Hallmark and Disney and that kind of conditioning we have, that our lives should be easy.
Oh,
And then
so
if it's not easy, that there's something wrong with us, that we're doing something wrong. And that's not true. Life is very hard.
mm,
And human beings, there's my dog.
oh,
Human,
wonderful. Very
human,
welcome in this talk.
yeah. And human beings are vulnerable. We live in these vulnerable mammal bodies, and we're vulnerable to sickness and decay and accidents and death. And we also have this immense capacity to love and cherish each other and be connected. And trauma interferes with that capacity for connection. And so if we can work with our trauma, our childhood trauma, but also what's happening as an adult, and if we can come into that kind of inspired place of, it's safe enough for me to be present with you and to have relationships that are me, they're authentic. I don't have to pretend. And I don't have to pretend that life is something that it's not. Life is what it is. And sometimes it's really hard. And can
Exactly.
we find strength in each other and through the truth, just telling the truth? This is what it's like for me right now. And
Exactly.
the freedom in that.
And I'm so glad you did touch on that, the truth that in society and community, there's that hallmark image we hold up, especially in family. There can be that perfect image of, family has to be perfect and
Yeah.
closeness. And while it can be all of that, the truth is that there can be ups and downs and everything in between in family.
Yeah.
And it really is the reality that family is one of those very big things that is an image conscious thing in society. But we can
Mhm.
experience trauma in our families. And
Absolutely.
Lynn,
Mhm.
to continue from what you were talking about previously with how trauma comes into our life, what exactly is trauma and how does it affect us both? Because you touched on this, that it does affect us mentally and physically. And I
Mhm.
know this is something we could spend hours on, but what should we be aware of in regard to how trauma affects us and our body and the impact it can have on our life?
That's such a good question. So maybe we could start with the nervous system.
Mm,
So most people understand fight or flight, and a lot of people now hear more about freeze or fawning. Pete Walker is another really great resource around trauma, who talks about the fawning response of going into compliance to keep ourselves safe. But when we go into a fight or a flight response, there's always a reason for that. And our nervous systems like store all of our previous experience in life
mm,
in our body. And our senses take in, okay, these are the visual images, these are the sounds, this is the tone of somebody's voice, this is the look on their face, and we react to that in our body. Our nervous system reacts. And so that's a good thing, except that we don't always have an accurate reading on what's safe and what's not safe as adults
mm,
because of unhealed childhood trauma. So the way that traumatic memories work, they're stored in our body along with sensations. So if we have that tight clench in our gut, or we have that feeling of dread and we kind of bring our shoulders up to our ears,
mhm,
those are associated with some experiences that led us to try to protect ourselves. So when we're healing trauma and we're working with trauma, we always want to be in this moment in time, because traumatic memory will take us back and it kind of feels like we're back in that traumatic moment.
yes.
But in fact, we need to stay grounded in this moment. So we do that through working with our breath. You could hold your own hands. You can look around the room and look for, 5 things you can see. There's all of these great tools that we have now to stay here in this moment. And
Mm,
it's from here then that we can look at that and go, there's something in me that still feels very wounded from that experience. And at the time, like for me, when I was in my early teens, I didn't have anybody that I could share that with. But
mm,
now I'm a resourced adult and I can connect with that 12-year-old. And I'm very familiar with her. So I've spent a lot of time with her. And
exactly.
just like, it's sad that that experience happened and that you didn't have anyone to talk to. And you're not alone anymore. And it was not your fault.
Mm,
When I look back at being 12 and I have a granddaughter who's almost 20 now, but when she was 12, I would look at that and go, wow, so that's a 12-year-old. That's how a 12-year-old thinks. That's the capacity a 12-year-old has. And she has real connection in her family. And just to be able to see, it's really clear that what happened to me was not my fault and that there was no way that I could have handled it in some perfect way. So I think that's really important for all of us to go back and look and say, okay, what happened was sad or hurtful or terrifying or whatever it was. And now I'm here. And I can find somebody to work with if I need that, which is often very helpful with traumatic memory. Or I can, use some of these resources that we have, or I can practice not being so hard on myself. I could practice
Yes.
connection and kindness, which is such a basic foundation of this healing. So that's something that we can all work with if we understand kind of how
Mm.
that works.
Well, that's wonderful insight, Lynn, and also such a true reminder of the journey of trauma, and the reminder that there's, because often we do get stuck with
We do.
the way things were or happened or the event, focus on that rather than exactly what you said, the reminder that time changes, we change, and we can look back to what happened and readdress it as a different person.
Mhm.
And also the wonderful reminder you talked about, as far as, which I'm very interested in, because I think this is what really builds trauma, and the how powerful it is in us as a roadblock, is the memory we hold in our body.
Right.
And so that, I'd love if you could just, dive a bit deeper into that, the truth that we store it in us. It's not just a case of we live through something and then the next day and continue, but it builds in us. Is that right, that it would build in
Yeah,
us as a feeling?
it does. And one of the reasons that we don't want to go into the body often, like we see so many people will say, I live from my head up, or they might not say that, but we can see it because it's everything that they talk about is kind of cognitive, not a lot of connection in their body or in their heart. That's partly
Mm,
why things like yoga and breathing practices are so good, because they bring us into our body and kind of get familiar with what is it that's going on in here. But often, what'll happen is a memory will come up because, maybe in yoga we're doing a heart opening pose. And all of a sudden this memory comes up that makes us cry or that's sad or something. Or when we're working with breathing, it can be very hard for many people to take deep breaths,
mm,
because if you're in a state of freeze as a protection, then we're trying to kind of stay away from the notice of somebody that could hurt us. And at the time that that was happening, freeze was might have been the best thing we could have done. But now we don't want to go through life in a state of freeze. So we need to find ways to heal that and to release that out of the body. And so one of the best ways to do that is to make that connection. So as we're feeling something coming up in the body, then to take a few deep breaths and to notice what it is that's happening, and to give ourselves an acknowledgement that this is hard. It's hard to be present with something like that
mm,
because it was overwhelming when it happened, and that's why we stored it.
mhm.
I've got a tickle in my throat here.
Oh yes, of course. No, have a drink. And I can go on to diving deeper into what you're just talking about. So you've shared some wonderful insight into what we need to be aware of, what we need to possibly start with as far as preparing ourselves for the state of mind that we should be in when facing our trauma. But if you could go over, Lynn, possibly in regards to all of that, how we find ourselves in a position where, we've got layers of history or emotion stored in
Right.
us, and how do we face this then? What would you recommend as being the best steps to take for when we start to face that trauma, be aware of it, and start healing from it?
So I think there's a few steps there. One is a basic understanding of how trauma works so that we can stop blaming ourselves for the reactions that we have and the thoughts that we have. Another is to have some tools that we can use when some traumatic memory comes up, or we're starting to go into a feeling of overwhelm or an emotional flashback.
Mhm,
So there's a couple of tools that I could just show you right now really quickly. And one of them is if you get stuck in a loop of thought, especially, and it might be, why did that happen to me? Or I'm scared, or whatever it might be. It wasn't fair that that happened. Why didn't I have someone there with me or something? Then we can just start to tap on the forehead, and just as you're tapping on your forehead, just take your attention away from the thought and just into the sound of the tapping and the sensation of it.
mhm,
And that helps to bring us back into this moment.
mm.
right? So there's
Mm.
a real moment sensation and
Feel that,
sound there,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Another thing that we can do with sensations in the body is that we can kind of work at it like it's a science, like we're reporting on it to a scientist or something. So if you have a feeling of, lots of people have a feeling of suffocation almost in the throat and in the chest, a heaviness in the chest. So one thing to do might be to just kind of look and go, am I actually still breathing? So
Mm.
sometimes those feelings can make it feel like I can't breathe, but every person I've ever asked has said, oh yeah, the air actually is still going through, right? So when we feel like we're suffocating, we're starting to panic. But when we actually pay attention, it's like, oh, okay, this is actually okay. It's intense, it's not comfortable, but it's not life-threatening.
Mm.
Another thing that we can do is to ask it why it's here, basically. So why has this sensation come up? So this is stored trauma with associated memories. So there's something is trying to get our attention,
Mm.
or something needs to be heard. So it's always some version of that. It's trying to protect me, it's trying to alert me. And so if we can look at it like that and actually be grateful, okay, here's something, this sensation in my body is here to let me know I'm in danger.
True.
So
Exactly.
now what could I do? Right. So
Mm.
I have a page on my website, a tab called Emergency Practices, and it
Yes, I
has a
love
lot of
it.
things you can do. Right. Yeah.
I love it. And we'll
Yeah.
be sharing your website and link. And I recommend everyone to go there because it's brilliant, Lynn. It's absolutely brilliant, those
Well,
practices.
and they're very simple tools, and everybody could do them, except when we're kind of overwhelmed with an emotional flashback or with fear, we forget because that part of our brain goes offline. And so
Mm,
we're just kind of stuck into that fight, flight, or freeze. But those
exactly.
practices will help us to reestablish that we're here in the moment and that we're safe in the moment.
Well, they are
Okay.
wonderful, Lynn, and I highly recommend them. And to continue on from that and how, how to face trauma and deal with it, Lynn, in regard to family struggles and conflict in family and possibly separation in family,
Mhm.
people are having to live with ongoing trauma. So, what do we do when faced with the reality that we have a situation in our lives that isn't going away and it does bring that ongoing trauma into our daily life? How do we cope with that? Or what can we do to start? To make sure that that trauma doesn't control our life? Do we keep repeating those steps that you mentioned? Or is there, for deep-seated ongoing trauma, is there something you can recommend?
Mm. And the statistics about intimate partner violence and child abuse are terrifying. They were before COVID and they've gotten a lot worse. And so if you're in a situation like that, where you're being physically, emotionally, sexually harmed, then try to find a way to get support to get out of that.
Mm.
Some of those situations are not workable. Um, and we just need to, find resources that can help us get out of the situation. And I know many, many people have done that as well. It's like before COVID, well, I'm hanging on until the kids are out of school or something like that. And then it's like, no, it's not a safe environment for me to be in. So
Mm.
that's, if it's that's going on, I would really urge people to take some kind of steps to get out of the situation.
Yes.
If it's something like there's a lot of families who are on the opposite sides of the vaccine fence, and
Hmm.
some are with COVID deniers, and some, I mean, there's a lot of tension there, and that's happening with some of my own family as well.
Yes.
To try to stay connected on some kind of a heart level, if that's possible. And also to really see people are operating from our lowest level, from our mammal instincts, our nervous
Mm.
system, and to try to come back up into the more human, the heart, the higher level brain development is really helpful. And we might not have cooperation from the other people who are around us. They might not have the capacity even to really stay grounded, or to remember that we love each other, and to
Mm.
treat us and to treat each other with respect and love. It can be really hard if we're in a state of fight, flight, or freeze.
Mm.
So to reach out for the resources that are available, to to learn how to speak with each other really from the heart and honestly and authentically, and and to know sometimes it's not going to work because, if that person is damaging to us, and that might be siblings or parents or children, then we might need to set a boundary that they're not going to be happy with. And that's a
Exactly.
process too, that as much as we can stay connected in our heart,
Mm,
it helps, but sometimes we have to do really hard things to protect ourselves or someone else.
so
It's a really
true.
tough situation.
So
Mm.
true. That's beautiful advice, Lynn, and also very needed in the world of family, because family can be a situation, an environment where we find it really hard to
Yeah.
break free from a situation because we feel tied, we feel that it's our role as a family member. And also we can find it very hard to exactly do what you said, the reminder to recognize that people are acting within their capabilities, that to
Yeah.
really remove yourself from the truth that it's not you. Again, going back to this removal from self-blame, or
Yes. Mhm.
really recognizing and having, as hard as it is, compassion for the truth that your family member is just doing what they know how to do or what they're capable of.
And it might not be what we need or want. Um,
Mm,
and and that's it can feel like we're giving up on somebody if we say, okay, that's enough. And I stayed in a relationship for many, many more years than I should have. It wasn't
so
healthy for
easy.
me, but I just kind of felt like, well, if I could just try harder, or if I could just make this happen, or that it would be better. And the end of the in the end, I really just had to look at that and go, she doesn't have the capacity to do this. I
Mm.
can't stay in this relationship.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's
And
not
that
to be, I love to remind people that it's not to say that they can't, that everyone's on their own journey of self-growth
right,
and realization, but exactly that at times we can't fix or change people.
yes, right.
Yes.
We could almost never change people.
No, I know. It's
We
and
have
yet
a
we
hard enough time
continue to
with
try.
ourselves.
Exactly. That's so true, isn't it? Oh, Lynn. And
Well, and just
to
just to
continue.
get back
Yes.
to a very practical little tool that Deb Dana offers
Oh, please do.
is to add the word yet to the end of the
Oh,
sentence.
I love that.
So it might be to say, I can't be open-hearted with her yet,
Mm,
or they can't stay regulated enough to treat me with respect yet.
hmm.
So it offers a lot of openness and possibility of things might change. And in the present, we have to deal with what actually is. So we need to make our decisions based on what is without hardening our hearts to what could be.
So
But that
true.
word yet on the end of a sentence can open up
Oh,
open up
it's so
some different
true.
possibilities.
So true.
Mhm.
And thank you for sharing that. That's such a powerful, instant action that you can do. It also offers relief. Like all of a sudden, the word yet, you just feel weight fall off your shoulders. Like, okay,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
relieves pressure of having to have an instant response or fix, but
Yeah.
exactly that, opening your heart to the reality that, okay, relief and peace and calm and
Mhm.
working towards something. I think that's
Mhm.
really
And the first
powerful.
part of the sentence is reality. So the first part, we're stating this is the reality. So,
Mm,
so often we'll say, well, I should be open-hearted. I should love them. I should be able to fix them. I should be able to tolerate them. But if in fact the reality is that I'm feeling open-hearted, okay. But if I'm feeling closed-hearted, then that's what it is. So
exactly.
to be able to just let ourselves have the experience we're having truthfully, and not shame ourselves for that, because there's no shame in that. We're
Mm,
not a bad person because we can't love someone who's behaving badly, or we don't want to be around them if they're hurting us. That's,
yes.
that's not a bad thing.
Yes, thank you for that, Lynn. It's a beautiful reminder and such a needed reminder because we do
Mm,
beat ourselves over the head.
we
And
do.
to continue on from what we've been talking about, the presence of ongoing trauma and an ongoing traumatic situation in our life. And you touched on this before, the what we store in our bodies. There's the reality that we're faced with triggers. And
Mhm.
can you explain to us what triggers are and why they can be the most painful, horrible thing to deal with, at a real physical level as well?
Mhm. So a trigger would remind us of that something's dangerous, usually is what a trigger would be. And some people don't like the word trigger. It feels like too harsh. You could
Mhm.
maybe look at it as an activation. So
Yes.
something
Good.
activates our nervous system, or something triggers us into response. So when that happens, our neuroception, which is our perception, it's unconscious. It's our primitive brain, our nervous system is saying, this is safe. Whoa, I don't know about that. This is dangerous. And it can be very subtle cues. So you might hear a deep booming voice that reminds you of somebody who used to yell at you, or you might see the look on someone's face, and there's a look of contempt on a coworker's face, for instance, and it reminds you of the look on your mother's face. Or so our system is always very helpfully, but not always accurately predicting, am I safe now or am I not? And if I'm not, then what am I going to do to get out of this? And we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And so part of the thing that's helpful here is to recognize that that's what's happening, and then to look at, well, is this really accurate? Is this an accurate assessment right now? So just because the look on someone's face or their tone of voice, or another thing that would happen is if, especially for women, when we're outside at night, if we see a guy, and maybe it's dark, or maybe this is a bigger person or something, and we're going to react as if it's dangerous, because we know from experience that it could be dangerous. And so not all of these triggers are bad, but so, we might have this, and then there's this kind of dread, and we look around to see if there's anybody who might help us. And, then we might take some deeper breaths, or so it's like the natural movement of the nervous system. And so it's not all bad. We're not trying to kind of always just be calm, because we do want to react to what's going on, right?
Exactly.
But we don't want to be carried away by it. And so that's where things like the grounding and orienting exercises are so good. So if for instance, box breathing, we inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. So you do that for 3 or 4 breaths. That will help to reset your nervous system. Or you take some deep inhales and then long, slow exhales. And Peter Levine, a trauma expert, talks about, he uses the syllable VU as you exhale. So you just breathe in deeply, and then VU, and just let that go on for at least 6 seconds if you can.
Great.
And just regulate yourself back into, okay, in this moment, then we can bring our higher level brain development into the picture. So we've had an activation or a trigger. We're looking around to assess, am I safe or not? What's the next thing for me to do? And all of this happens lightning fast in the primitive brain, in our nervous system. But when we bring our conscious mind to it, then we can also bring that wisdom to it. So what might have been threatening or scary when we were a kid might not be so much anymore. We might still have the trigger or the reaction, but then we can go, okay, this reminds me of this, and this isn't the situation anymore. I know I have my car keys. I can get up and walk out the door, or whatever it is. Like, we're not actually trapped the way we are as children.
Yes, that's
bringing
brilliant.
that mindfulness to it can really help.
That's brilliant, Lynn, and such needed advice, because when we do go through that physical reaction of a trigger, those exercises are fantastic ways to just immediately cut through that, which is so needed. And I think you just touched on this, but as far as triggers that we do know to be present in our life, that we're possibly fearful of, maybe coming across old photographs, or like you said, hearing a voice that might trigger us to remember someone. Is there a way to be prepared for that? Or is it just the case of reminding ourselves that, okay, I'll be able to move on from that. I know the exercises to do.
And some of each, I think. Like, sometimes when we're going into a specific situation, like if you're going to a family event and some of the people there are going to be drinking. And in the past, when everybody got drinking, eventually things broke down and somebody started yelling or something, right?
Yes.
So you could make a plan ahead of that, and you could go, okay, I'm only going to go for the first couple hours, then I'm going to make an excuse to leave, or I'm going to set something up to give me an escape if it starts to go south, And so sometimes we can plan ahead like that. Sometimes for like an important interview or something like that, when we know we're going to be nervous, we're going to be judged by somebody, they're evaluating us, we can do like a rehearsal and we go through and we look
Yes.
and we just kind of see, okay, when did I start holding my breath? What are the thoughts in my mind? If I think about going into that room and seeing their faces, so we kind of rehearse it ahead of time. And then as soon as we start to get activated, we'll do some tapping, we'll do some breathing, hold our own hands, so we can kind of lock in some things that will help us to regulate. And then
That's it. Yeah.
there's that long-term build resilience. And then that will always help, no matter what we're kind of unexpectedly coming across.
Exactly. And I'm glad you threw that in, because the reminder that we do get stronger, that,
Do.
depending on where we are in our healing journey or working through stages of our healing or trauma, it is true that we do get stronger. We find practices that work for us. We find ways to prepare for possible, fallbacks, and we do get stronger. We do build our resiliency. It's true. So I'm so glad
It is
that
true.
you
Yeah.
reminded us of that, because a lot of times people, especially if they're in the early stages of facing something,
Yeah.
they can feel that overwhelmed feeling that it's never going to change.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
does.
It does change. And
Exactly.
sometimes it changes, sometimes I'll be working with somebody and, um, there was one just really simple example of somebody was at a grocery store and they'd bought a whole bunch of groceries for like a month. It was really early in COVID, like April or May in 2020. And the clerk kind of gave them this look like, oh, you're a hoarder, aren't you? And a loser kind of,
Yeah.
and she said, her husband has a health issue. I didn't want to go every week. So I bought a bunch. Right. And,
Yeah.
but she said, I just got into the shame storm kind of
Oh.
about it.
Mm.
Right. And then like a year later, she was talking about something kind of similar that had happened. And I said, so what was going on in your mind this time? And she said, well, nothing really. I was just like, well, I don't care what that person thinks. It doesn't really affect me. Right.
Fantastic.
So we could kind of look back and say, a year ago, you were shaming yourself. And now you just took a few deep breaths, you regulated your system again. And then it's not there. So we're not storing new trauma in our body either. We're releasing some of the old.
Thank you for pointing that out, because like I said, the truth is that for many of us, or for, especially in the early days, we can feel like it's never going to change, or
Yeah.
we'll always be faced with those feelings. But the truth is, and like you pointed out, we see it, that you do get stronger, and situations change. So I'm so glad you pointed that out.
Mm-hmm.
And Lynn, in keeping with coping and change, you mentioned before, and we talked about the healing tools that you have created, and your emergency practices. I'd love if you could highlight maybe one or two of your favorite ones, that, especially in keeping what we talked about, that, when faced with these feelings, and, out and about, or on the go, or at home. And what is one or two of these practices that you would recommend people start with, as having their toolkit of, okay, let's do
Yeah.
this as
Yeah.
needed.
So if working with the breath works for someone, I would always suggest starting with that, because it's an immediate correction kind of. So if you notice that you're holding your breath, you could take a couple of deep breaths. You could do something like box breathing, where you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4. And just 2 or 3 times of that will really help to reset things as well.
Good.
And all of the tools that we use are meant to remind us that here in this moment, we're safe. You could hold your own hands, kind of feel
Oh, I
the
love
warmth of
that.
your own hands. That's a lovely one. And
Yes.
then there's another, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 senses practice, where we use our senses to orient back to the here. So you'd look around the room and look at 5 things you can see, and you say it out loud. So you'd say, I see a picture, I see a window, I see,
Yes.
and
Yes.
4 things you can touch. And like I can touch the coolness of my desk, the warmth of my skin. And so touch 4 things. And then 3 things that you can hear. So 3 sounds that you can hear, or you might even bring to mind a favorite sound, like favorite music or something. But, I hear the traffic, I hear my dog snoring, whatever it is, right? And then 2 things that you can smell, or 2 favorite smells. And so I love the smell of the rain after, the earth after it rains. So to kind of just bring those to mind. And then 1 favorite taste. So I like the taste of whatever it is, coffee in the morning, if you drink coffee or something. And
Mm.
so so we're bringing ourselves in through our active senses. And that can be something that if you have, it takes 2 minutes or something, it can really help you.
That's
And if you're out and about and that's happening, you can also just kind of anchor into something, look around for cues of safety.
mm.
So is there anything here that you can, and like when I referred to that, if you're out at night and you see somebody, so we look around to see, is there anybody here who can help? Um, is the safe, oh, there's a storefront with a light, I can walk over in that direction. And so we're looking for ways that we can keep ourselves safe. And so
Mm.
sometimes it's practical like that. I could walk across the street and go over to that store. Or sometimes it's more, I could just take a few deep breaths. I could notice that I'm alarmed, and then I could tune into that instead of going on. And we haven't really talked much about thoughts in the mind, but
Mm.
oftentimes our mind will get really into catastrophic thinking.
Yes.
And then if that's happening, then we could notice that too. And our mind doesn't really know the difference between what we imagine and what's actually happening. So if we
So
vividly
true.
imagine through catastrophic thinking, we're going to just be in a state of alarm all the time. So that's not a helpful pattern.
Exactly. And I'm so glad you did mention that, because I did want to touch on that exact thought, Lynn, and to dive deeper into the tools that you have created and healing tools, your amazing book, Friends with Your Mind. And again, we'll be sharing the link so people can find that, because it really is the most amazing resource for helping people come to terms with their experiences and heal from them. And exactly what you just touched on, the truth that our mind has such a powerful part to play in healing. And can you just share your thoughts on that, Lynn, how we can use our thought patterns and use our mind for healing, the power of that?
Mm. Well, one thing that I've learned through experimenting and observing my mind is a couple things. One is that almost all of the thoughts that kind of grab our attention and take it away somewhere are generated by the primitive brain. So it's, well, what if this happens? How am I going to handle that? Or we go into the past. Well, when that person said this, I should have said that. Or, so we tend to be very absorbed in the past or the future. And there's not that much else that's going on in the mind often, other than worry about the future or ruminating about the past. And so to be able to watch them, and one of the tools sometimes is just to imagine that you're kind of sitting behind your head and you're watching thoughts. Thoughts generally appear in the area of our brain and behind our forehead. And if you were just to sit for a moment and just watch thoughts as they come in. So give yourself 10 or 15 seconds and see what comes onto the screen. And you'll notice that some thoughts just kind of roll through the background. They don't have a lot of grab.
Mm.
Sometimes we get really caught up in a train of thought. And sometimes it's practical, like you might be thinking, well, how much more time do we have left? We're just about at the end of the interview. I need to be able to ask her this or something, right?
Like you said, a real stream of just constantly moving and cycling thoughts, and yes, the presence of things. Exactly.
So if we can witness that, if we can watch the thoughts and just see, okay, here comes this thought. That's pretty neutral. Oh, okay, now I'm thinking about, well, what if I forget something? Or what if, what if this, what if that? Oh, I notice now that I'm holding my breath, or I have this heaviness in my chest. So then when we're watching thoughts, we can also watch our body and notice, what is the response in my body? Then we can come back to presence, and we can, we're more than our thoughts. So if we get back into the, kind of the stream of meditation, one of the things that meditation and mindfulness does is it helps us to realize thoughts come and go in our mind, and they can really grab our attention, especially if there's a threat involved. And we can practice not getting carried away in a stream of thought. And there's lots of tools to do that. Tapping is a great one for thoughts.
Yes.
Seeing them on a screen as though they're just kind of passing by. All of those things will help.
And you just mentioned as well a way to help be aware of our thoughts and process them and face them as opposed to just shutting them up and ignoring
Right.
them.
We don't want to suppress them.
No, exactly. Yeah. And you just mentioned that to help this, which is, I'm glad you did, because another area that you specialize in, which I would love you to just mention the power of, is meditation. And
Mhm.
and again, just how does this support exactly what all we've been talking about? And also, is there a way that we can quickly incorporate that into our life? And because a lot of people see meditation as maybe a time consuming thing, or
Right.
something that is a practice that they don't know how to do. But I'd love if you could share with us just quickly how it is something that we can bring into our life and our daily
Definitely.
routine.
Yeah. So one thing that can be helpful to know is that we don't have to, sit in complete silence, for instance, for
Good.
meditation. We can do guided practices, which are actually more helpful a lot of the time. When we're bringing in the whole issue of trauma, if we have a lot of energy in our body, a lot of those associated thoughts, we're probably not going to want to sit in silence, because what happens when we stop the outside distractions is that our mind will start to come in, and we'll
Mm,
have all of those thoughts, and then we actually don't meditate at all. We're just kind of caught in the thoughts. So one way to look at it is, if thoughts are on the surface, like of the surface of a lake or something, if we can go down into the quieter parts of the lake, we all have a stillness in the mind, and we can't always access it because we're worried. We have a lot
mm,
of other kinds of things going on. Part of the benefit of doing this work is that things start to quiet down.
mm,
So if you think about what's going on in most people's mind, what was going on in my mind before I started really kind of healing this, I was always thinking about the past or the future.
mm,
And the future was always some kind of catastrophic. Well, what if this happens? And what if that happens? And how am I going to deal with this? And, it was a very primitive brain way to try to keep me safe, but it was really anxiety producing. So
mm,
as I healed from that, and our mind gets stronger, our ability to focus gets stronger as we practice. Then now when I go in, and even just on a regular basis, like when we're talking right now, I'm just really focused on
mm.
our discussion. So I don't have a lot of outside thoughts coming through, right? Whereas
Exactly.
before it was very hard even to focus on something, because this would come up, and then I'd be thinking about that, and then that and that.
Yes,
And
yes.
so we all have this stillness inside of us. And the only thing that prevents us from really accessing that is the thoughts in our mind, and
Mm,
maybe, the energy in our body that we're not wanting to be really present with.
it's
So
interesting.
these tools of calming our mind, calming the body, breathing more deeply, that's what enables us to really, really know the stillness that's here. And that's really worthwhile for everybody. And everybody can do that.
Mm, gosh, and they really are such effective, powerful tools. Just listening to you talk about everything, Lynn, provides relief and comfort. Just hearing you talk about and guide us through the reminder of those practices. And boy, we really could talk for hours about each one of
We
them.
could. We
It
could.
really is so true. And
Yeah.
it's been such a
Yeah.
wonderful talk, Lynn. As a last question, for anyone that is currently feeling trapped by their situation and trapped by trauma in their life, do you have a final piece of advice from the heart you can share, or a piece of encouragement for anyone that feels like trauma is controlling their life?
Yeah. Give yourself a break,
Mm,
basically. It's not your fault. It's not our fault what happened to us as children. And, we could go into intergenerational trauma and all kinds of other ways of understanding that. But really, what it boils down to is what happened to you as a child was not your fault. And if you didn't have a close, accepting love, compassion, if you didn't have that empathetic connection, then there's some things that you can do as an adult to work with that and to get that. And that it's really worthwhile. And it's really all about love and compassion for ourselves.
mm.
And then as we feel steadier in that, then we can offer that to each other as well.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing that, Lynn. That is such wonderful advice. It's
Oh, thank
beautiful
you.
and
It's been
needed
nice
to
having
hear
this
for all of
conversation.
us. Now, before you go, you have created, we've touched on this, an amazing platform of help and resources. Your website, your guided meditations, coaching, your fantastic book, and all the work you do with the Killerby Centre. And we're sharing links to everything next to this video so that people can go straight to all of those
Great.
things. But is there
Mhm.
anywhere you'd like to personally recommend as being a great starting place, or for how people should stay connected with you?
Definitely my website, lynnfraserstillpoint.com.
Mm-hmm.
And then to invite people to daily practice. For over 6 years now, every single day at 8 a.m. Eastern, I lead a free online guided relaxation breathing meditation practice. And
Wonderful.
lots of people have been coming for 3 or 4 years every day. And it changes our lives when we can
Mm.
do that. Some people drop in once or twice a week. Some people come when they can. I'm also on Insight Timer, but all of the links for that kind of thing you can find through my website.
Wonderful. Well, like I said, we'll be sharing that with everyone. And those, I can definitely encourage people to go and start with those places, and your newsletter, which is amazing every week.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
so definitely all of those things. And
yeah.
Lynn, thank you for all the amazing insight, help, and wisdom you've shared with us today. It has been such an honor to have you involved on this summit. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for doing the summit. I think it's really important for people to have these resources and to hear these conversations.
Definitely. Well, you have helped and have
Yeah.
made this summit truly wonderful. So thank you so much, Lynn. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.